The clock in the city courthouse had just struck midnight when the first shadow moved. The building sat heavy with silence, its stone walls holding decades of justice and corruption alike. In the deserted street outside, a single car idled with its lights off, the exhaust curling faintly in the cold night air. Inside the courthouse, a pair of gloved hands picked the lock to a back door, as if it were a child's toy. The midnight heist had begun. The intruder knew every corner of the courthouse. The steps he took were precise, rehearsed, almost surgical. He had memorized the guard shifts, the security cameras, and even the faulty wiring that made one camera blink every 45 seconds. It wasn't greed that guided his movements, though. It was something older, deeper, and far more dangerous: revenge. Years before, a man named Elias Kane had stood in this very building, accused of a crime he did not commit. Fraud, embezzlement, the kind of white-collar crime that destroyed reputations overnight. He had lost his company, his family had abandoned him, and his name had become a whispered cautionary tale. The trial was swift, the verdict harsher than anyone expected: 20 years in prison. But Elias knew the truth. Someone had planted the evidence, forged the signatures, manipulated the case files. That someone had walked free, rising higher in power, while Elias rotted in a cell. But fate had a strange sense of timing. A clerical error, a misplaced report, and suddenly Elias was released after 12 years. Broken, but not defeated. During those years behind bars, he had nurtured his anger like a gardener tending to a poisonous flower. He had read every law book he could get his hands on, memorized the system, and waited. And when freedom finally came, Elias did not seek peace. He sought the file that would prove who had set him up, the file that would unravel everything. Now he moved through the courthouse like a ghost, guided not by maps or blueprints, but by memory. He remembered every word of the prosecutor who had sneered at him. He remembered the self-satisfied smirk of Victor Harrow, his former business partner, who had testified against him with chilling precision. Elias knew Harrow had orchestrated everything, but knowing was not enough. He needed proof, something he could drag into the light. And that proof, he was certain, lay in the courthouse archives, buried in a locked cabinet labeled confidential. Case number 3147. The Kane trial. The deeper he went, the more the building seemed to shift around him, each corridor echoing with the footsteps of his past. He passed the courtroom where the jury had once stared at him like a cornered animal. He passed the judge's chambers, where whispers of deals and debts were made. And finally, he reached the records room. The door was steel, but the lock was old. Elias pulled a small pouch from his coat, laid out his tools, and worked with careful hands. In less than a minute, the tumblers clicked. He slipped inside, and there it was, the wall of files stretching from floor to ceiling, history stacked in cardboard and ink. He scanned the numbers until his eyes caught it. 3147. The drawer groaned open. Inside were folders, thick with transcripts, statements, exhibits. But something was wrong. The original evidence files were missing, replaced by sanitized reports. He rifled faster, the papers whispering against his gloves, until he found a single envelope tucked at the back. His breath caught as he slid it open. Photographs, financial statements, handwritten notes, and at the bottom, a signed confession, not his, but Victor Harrow's, never entered into the court record. Elias froze, the weight of the discovery sinking into him. This was it. The proof. The weapon. But he wasn't alone. A noise came from the hall. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate. He shoved the envelope into his coat and slipped into the shadows just as the record's door opened. A flashlight beam cut through the dark, swinging across the rows of files. The guard muttered something under his breath, stepped inside, and Elias moved. Silent as a blade, he slid past the man and out the door before the beam could find him. The courthouse was alive now with danger. Every creak of the floor seemed louder, every shadow heavier. Elias retraced his path, but he knew he had only minutes before the missing file was discovered. He reached the back door, pushed it open, and felt the rush of cold night air against his face. The car was waiting. He slipped inside, the engine humming softly as the driver, a young woman with sharp eyes and a calm grip on the wheel, glanced at him. She was the daughter of an old friend, one of the few who had believed in his innocence. She asked no questions as he clutched the envelope, his knuckles white. As they drove into the sleeping city, Elias opened the file again, letting the words and signatures burn into his memory. The revenge file was in his hands now, and with it, the power to dismantle the empire Victor Harrow had built. But Elias did not smile. Revenge, he knew, was not a single act. It was a war of attrition, a game of patience, and tonight was only the first move. In the rearview mirror, the courthouse shrank into the distance, its secrets exposed to the night. Elias leaned back, closed his eyes, and whispered to himself, not in triumph, but in promise. The case of the midnight heist, he murmured. And soon, the case of justice. The city was restless by morning. Newspapers spoke of routine politics, business mergers, and scandals that half the population already expected, but none of them carried the truth of what had unfolded in the courthouse just hours earlier. Only Elias Kane held that truth, wrapped inside the envelope that now rested on the table of a dim apartment far from the eyes of anyone who might recognize him. The blinds were drawn, the air thick with the smell of burnt coffee. Elias sat hunched in a wooden chair, the file spread out before him like a surgeon dissecting an old wound. Each page bled memories. His signature, crudely forged. Bank transfers he had never authorized. Emails doctored to make him appear guilty. But there, in black ink, lay the salvation he had waited for. The confession letter from Harrow. It wasn't complete. It was unsigned, a draft maybe, but the handwriting was unmistakable. Elias knew Harrow's arrogance well enough to recognize that the man must have written it in a moment of overconfidence, planning perhaps to use it as leverage against others. Still, it was not enough. A draft could be dismissed, forged itself, laughed out of court by the very machine that had once buried him. Elias needed more records, witnesses, something to tie the confession to the empire Harrow had built on betrayal. The woman who had driven him, her name was Lena, watched from the corner of the room. She had been silent since they left the courthouse, her sharp eyes fixed on him, but now she spoke. "You can't just sit on this," she said. "Harrow's not the type to leave loose ends. If he suspects you're alive and digging, he'll come for you." Elias rubbed his temples, the weight of exhaustion pressing down. "He already came for me. 12 years ago. Now it's my turn." Lena shook her head. "Revenge isn't justice. If you want to ruin him, you need a plan. Something bigger than breaking into a courthouse." Her words cut, but they were true. Elias had spent so long nurturing anger that the idea of strategy had become secondary. But now, staring at the papers, he realized Lena was right. This wasn't about one night. It was about dismantling an empire brick by brick. He began to dig. Days turned into nights as Elias traced every line in the file, cross-referencing old case notes with records he found online, building a map of Harrow's corruption. Offshore accounts, shell companies, political donations masked as charity. Every trail led deeper, every discovery another knot pulled loose. He found names of judges, prosecutors, businessmen, men who had smiled in the courtroom while he was condemned. And then came the first message. It was slid under the apartment door in the middle of the night, no sound of footsteps, no knock. Just an envelope with his name written in block letters. Inside, a single sheet of paper. "You should have stayed buried." Lena saw his hands shake as he read it. "He knows," she said simply. Elias looked out the window, the city lights reflecting in his tired eyes. He had expected this. Harrow was a predator, and predators always circled the moment they smelled defiance. But instead of fear, Elias felt something sharper rise within him, a grim satisfaction. If Harrow knew, then the game had truly begun. The next move was Elias's. He sent copies of the draft confession, along with carefully selected pieces of evidence, to a journalist who had once tried to defend him in print, back when no one else dared. He knew the man had been ridiculed, his career nearly ended for siding with the fraudster. Sending the file to him was not only a gamble, but an invitation to redemption. The journalist called 2 days later. His voice trembled with disbelief. "Kane, is this real?" "As real as the years I lost," Elias said. "And it's only the beginning." By the end of that week, whispers were spreading. Anonymous reports leaked about Victor Harrow's offshore accounts. A senator who had supported Harrow was suddenly under investigation for bribery. Every move Elias made was careful, calculated, designed not to reveal himself yet but to peel away Harrow's armor one layer at a time. And Harrow, true to his nature, struck back. One evening, Lena returned to the apartment to find the lock broken. The room was wrecked, papers scattered, the table overturned. Elias was gone. On the floor, in the middle of the chaos, lay a single page from the revenge file, pinned to the wood with a knife. It read, "You can't steal what I already own." Harrow had him, or so it seemed, but Elias Kane was not the same man who had walked into prison 12 years ago. He had expected this move, too. Victor Harrow's private estate sat on the edge of the city, a fortress of glass and steel that gleamed in the night like a crown jewel. Inside, men in dark suits moved with military precision, earpieces buzzing with coded chatter. In the center of it all, Harrow himself sat in his study, the firelight licking the edges of his face. He was older now, grayer, but the arrogance was still there, the quiet certainty of a man who believed the world bent to his will. On the desk before him lay the envelope Elias had stolen, recovered by his men in the raid on the apartment. Harrow tapped his finger on the unsigned confession draft, a faint smirk curling his lips. "You think you're clever, Kane," he murmured. "But you never learned. I control the pieces. You're just another pawn." But Harrow didn't know everything. The break-in at the apartment had gone exactly as Elias intended. He and Lena had left hours earlier, taking the real file with them. What Harrow's men found was bait, a doctored copy, filled with just enough truth to make him think he'd regained the upper hand. And in the chaos of that staged raid, Elias had vanished from the grid entirely. For days, Harrow's network scoured the city. His men shook down journalists, hacked servers, silenced anyone who whispered Kane's name. But all the while, Elias was moving in silence. He had hidden himself in places Harrow would never think to look: underground libraries, abandoned factories, the basements of sympathetic strangers who still remembered the trial that had ruined him. And in those shadows, Elias built his counterattack. The first strike came through the markets. An anonymous leak revealed Harrow's offshore accounts in Zurich, complete with transaction histories linking him to shell corporations involved in weapons smuggling. The news hit like a thunderclap. Stocks tied to Harrow's conglomerates plummeted overnight. Politicians who once toasted his name scrambled to distance themselves. Then came the second strike. A video surfaced on the dark web, grainy but clear enough. Harrow, years younger, in a secret meeting with a judge who had presided over Elias's trial. The judge accepted a briefcase, the kind that spoke louder than any words. Within hours, the footage spread across anonymous forums, then mainstream media, until the name, Victor Harrow, became synonymous with corruption. Harrow responded with fury. He tightened his security, unleashed smear campaigns, paid off old allies to spin the story. But it was like plugging holes in a sinking ship. Every time he closed one leak, Elias opened another. And then Elias made his boldest move yet. He sent Harrow a letter, hand-delivered by a child no older than 10, who disappeared into the crowd before the guards could catch him. Inside the envelope was a single playing card, the King of Spades, scrawled with one sentence: "You framed me once. Now I'll frame you forever." For the first time in decades, Victor Harrow felt the sting of fear. He lashed out. His men raided safe houses, traced calls, interrogated suspects. One night, Lena barely escaped an ambush meant to silence her. But the chaos only confirmed what Elias had known all along: Harrow was unraveling. Meanwhile, Elias prepared the final strike. He had gathered enough evidence to bury Harrow, but evidence alone would not satisfy him. He wanted Harrow to see him, to know exactly who had orchestrated the collapse. So he set the stage. In the dead of night, Harrow's private study computer pinged with a new message. It was a live feed, grainy, flickering, but unmistakable. Elias Kane sat in a darkened room, the true revenge file spread out before him. His voice was low, steady, the voice of a man who had waited 12 years for this moment. "You took my freedom," Elias said. "You stole my name. Now I'll take everything from you, and when there's nothing left, when your empire is ashes, you'll remember me. Not as your pawn, not as your victim, but as the man who beat you at your own game." The feed cut to black, and outside Harrow's estate, somewhere in the shadows, Elias smiled for the first time in years. The midnight heist had only been the opening move. The real revenge was still unfolding.